Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. This thing just arrived in the mail today. It's the Anbernic RG35XXSP. Now today we'll do an impressions video, so I'm going to talk about how it looks and how it feels, you know, the buttons, the ergonomics, things like that. Then give me a few days and I can do some more testing and we will then do a final review. Now this device is a clamshell form factor, which is unique for Anbernic and the first one they've ever done, but it's got the same internals and everything as other devices they've released, including like the horizontal version, the RG35XXH, which personally is my favorite among this line. But then we also have a vertical version, just the standard RG35XX Plus. And then we have the mini version, the RG28XX. Yeah, these names are just crazy. Now I think there's a lot of excitement for this device. I'm excited about it, and you might be too. And I think it has to do with the Game Boy Advance SP, which this thing basically looks like a copy of. And so I think a lot of people are trying to, you know, have that nostalgic feel again, but with a device that will be able to play all the way up to like Dreamcast and Nintendo 64. So it's really interesting to have something so powerful in this really beloved clamshell form factor. Anyway, we'll take a look at all that stuff in this video, and I just want to dive into it. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, let's start with the specs, and like I mentioned, these are not going to be very surprising. We've now seen the all-winner H700 in about 3 or 4 different Anbernic devices with the same internal GPU and 1GB of RAM. The display is also the same, it's 3.5 inches with a 480p resolution and it's an IPS LCD. They're also using the same size batteries, 3300 milliamp hours, and they say it's going to get, you know, somewhere between 6 to 8 hours of gameplay depending on what you're playing. But of note, it is a little bit on the heavy side just because there's so much plastic in a clamshell, so it's a little bit under 200 grams or 7 ounces. As far as connectivity and other features, it's got all the things you would expect, so 5 GHz Wi-Fi, Bluetooth 4.2, as well as a mini HDMI out port, a headphone jack, and a rumble motor. Now let's move on to the unboxing. So we have 4 different color types. We have 2 that are going to be solid, that's silver and DMG gray, and then we also have 2 transparent models, both blue and black. Other than that, the box seems to be very typical Anbernic, so mostly white with the design on the front. Inside, we'll get a quick start manual that'll mostly talk about the different button functions, and then we will also get a screen protector and then a USB-A to USB-C charging cable. Let's go ahead and take a look at the device itself, and man, this thing looks so much like a Game Boy Advance SP. I'm really glad they sent over this silver model because it's a new color for them and I think it looks really good. Now, first impression is that this thing is surprisingly large and thick compared to a regular Game Boy Advance SP. We'll do some size comparisons later in the video, but yeah, that was the first thing that struck me is that, man, this thing's a little bit beefy. Let's go ahead and start with the I/O around the device, starting with the bottom. Here we've got a headphone jack on the left and then 2 microSD card slots, one for the operating system and one for additional games. On the right side we have our power and reset buttons as well as 2 LED indicators. If we plug in the device to charge, you'll see an orange light on the left and then a green light when it's powered on the right. Let's take a look up top. So we have our shoulder and trigger buttons all in a line, and then also our USB and HDMI ports. The USB port will be used for both charging as well as accessories. Now, as far as the shoulder and trigger buttons go, if you look at them dead on, you can see that the trigger buttons are actually a little bit more elevated than the shoulder buttons. And this does make them pretty easy to find with your fingers. Of note, these buttons have a micro switch connection, which means they are pretty clicky. Let me give you a sound test right here. And so yeah, that's pretty loud. Let's compare it against my aftermarket Game Boy Advance SP. Of note, the shoulder and trigger buttons are pretty loose. If we shake it, you can hear a rattle. And again, that's something that's not really present in the Game Boy Advance SP. And so yes, when it comes to these particular buttons, I do find them to be rather loud. Now in terms of actually using the buttons, I find them to be pretty easy to actually press down on, and even when you have the clamshell open and extended all the way, there's plenty of space for your fingers. Now by virtue of just this overall clamshell shape, I would not say that you're going to want to play a lot of games that are trigger intensive in particular, but I think if you're going to be using these occasionally, for example with games that don't rely on them too much, or maybe as hotkeys, I think they'll be just fine. Much like with other clamshells and vertical devices, it does require a bit of a claw grip to actually press them, but it's really going to depend on the games that you're playing and whether or not you want to play something that's so trigger intensive. I definitely wouldn't want to play a first-person shooter game on this, but I think for retro games it'll be fine. Okay, let's keep going and knock out the rest of the I/O. On the left side, we have our volume up and down, and now let's take a look at the back. First thing you will notice there is a battery compartment, so let's go ahead and open this up. And sure enough, yes, we've got our 3300 milliamp hour battery. One thing of note is that directly underneath the battery is the H700 CPU. And I'm not a big fan of this. I don't like it when the CPU is right next to the battery, but it does look like Anbernic tried to put some mitigations into place. For example, around the battery there is a little piece of plastic bracing, and I did find that it is a little bit raised over the CPU, and so because the battery is going to be resting on the bracing and not the CPU, I don't think it's going to be directly touching it. It's a little bit closer than I would like it to be, but thankfully I didn't really find the battery compartment or the CPU to get very warm while I was playing anyway. It's definitely something that I could feel while I was playing with certain games, but not to the point where I would call it hot or even uncomfortable. Also on the back here we have these little plastic bumps. I don't think these have much of a function. They don't like keep the device stuck into place or anything. They're probably just there to prevent scratching on the case. Okay, opening it up, let's take a look at the hinge here, and this looks to be almost identical to the one on the Game Boy Advance SP. And it looks like we have a 2-click system, so the initial click is going to be kind of your standard angle, very similar to the SP, but if you'd like you can also push it back to a full 180 degrees. In fact, it looks to be a little bit more than that. So we definitely have a wide range to work with, and it's hard to say whether or not this is going to endure over time given the fact that this is just my first few hours with the device. But I can say that it is very similar to the GBA SP, and I think that's a good thing. In fact, if we open it up, you can see the default angle is about the same. And same thing with the SP, this one can also go to a full 180 degrees, if not a little bit more. So if anything, the hinge is almost identical to the original Game Boy Advance SP, and that is not a bad thing at all. Next, we'll take a look at the controls, and these are the first clicky buttons that I've noticed from Anbernic. Both the D-pad and the face buttons use either a dome switch or a micro switch connection. And these buttons are pretty firm and quite loud. Let's do an audio test here and also compare it to the Game Boy Advance SP. So again, a very similar situation where these are quite a bit louder than the original, and they're also a little bit more stiff as well. Now that being said, I think they're actually pretty good controls, just a little bit different than what you may expect from Anbernic. Let's do a couple real-world tests to see how the experience is going to be. We'll start with a Contra test, and because this is a clicky D-pad, it's not going to be the same in terms of rocking back and forth. As you can see, when I push down on the D-pad and then try to move it left and right, the character doesn't move at all. However, I wouldn't consider this to be a bad thing, because if I want to hit a diagonal, I can absolutely do that. That's one of the nice things about having a clicky D-pad, is that it feels very, very precise. And so when playing a game like Contra, yes, it doesn't really pass the Contra test in the fact that the character doesn't wiggle around when I move it, but I still think that this is a fully playable game with this kind of control setup. It's just a little bit different than a classic controller. And because it's a clicky D-pad, you will get a physical response anytime you press it diagonally or to a cardinal direction, and so it is a very precise experience. And so when playing a more precision game like Celeste on Pico 8, yeah, this feels absolutely great. Every single move that I want to do goes exactly where I want it to. And I found it to be a pretty good experience with Capcom-style fighting games as well. Now, admittedly, I'm not great at playing these games with a clicky D-pad, so I am missing these inputs quite a bit, but that's mostly because I need to acclimate to this D-pad, and it does require quite a bit of force to actually make the move. But I will say that if you don't mind playing with a clicky D-pad, then fighting games are going to be just fine. However, one thing I did notice is that the force required to fully press a button was pretty darn high. And recently someone tipped me off to a way of actually measuring the amount of force required to press a button. So let's do a rudimentary and non-scientific test for this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put my device on a scale, and then I'm going to measure how much force it takes to actually press down on the button. Now, as you can imagine, it's kind of hard to actually measure this because you actually press down the button more than you need to. So you do end up having to press it down like a dozen times just to get a feel for how much force it actually requires. Anyway, after doing a bunch of testing, I figured it to be around 130 grams with the 35XXSP. On the regular Game Boy Advance SP, these buttons are a lot lighter, and it only takes around 80 grams to actually push the button down. Let's try another clicky device. We'll do the PS Vita, and this one is very similar in that it takes about 80 grams as well. And so even though these are both very clicky devices, they take a lot less force to actually press down on the button. Now, Anbernic is known for having pretty stiff buttons, even with their rubber membrane buttons. So for example, with the RG35XXH, it still takes about 110 grams. So I would say if you think that a standard Anbernic controller is a little bit too hard to press on the buttons, it's going to be even worse with the SP. By contrast, other devices that have lighter buttons, like the Miyoo Mini Plus, are quite a bit lower. For example, here I measured it to be about 60 grams for the Miyoo Mini Plus. And the lightest buttons that I could find were my Nintendo Switch Lite. These were only about 50 grams. So when it comes down to it, yes, these are pretty stiff buttons, about 130 grams of force required for me to press the button down all the way. And I do think that for some people, they will find these buttons to be a little bit fatiguing. And unfortunately, I don't think this is something that will soften over time. So in summary, the RG35XXSP buttons are clicky and a little bit loud and quite hard to press down on. Now in terms of ergonomics and comfort, I think this is pretty standard compared to the Game Boy Advance SP. The device is slightly rounded both on the back as well as the front, and so it does have a boxy feel to it, but if you've ever held a Game Boy Advance SP, it's a very similar experience. And honestly, I've got no complaints when it comes to the comfort. If it was good enough for Nintendo, it's good enough for this device as well. Next, let's start with some size comparisons. So on the left, we have the 35XXSP, and then on the right, we have my aftermarket Game Boy Advance SP. And when you look at them head on, they look to be of a pretty similar size. However, when you stack them up, you can see that the Game Boy Advance SP is quite a bit smaller. I would say the Anbernic device is about 10% larger, both in terms of width as well as in thickness. And using my calipers, you can see it's 27.25 with the Anbernic and then 24.58 with the GBA SP. In terms of pocketability, I would say this is still a very pocketable device, but it is a little bit thicker than I would like. I wouldn't consider this to be a deal breaker, but when putting in my pocket, it is definitely something that feels a little bit more bulgy than you might expect. And I think that once this device starts shipping and getting into people's hands, there's going to be quite a few people that are going to realize this is a bit chunkier than they were expecting. Now, to be fair, the Game Boy Advance SP was still pretty thick and bulging when you put it in your pocket. So it's not a huge difference between the two, but all the same, even after getting used to carrying around a Game Boy Advance SP over the past month or so, getting the Anbernic one was quite a big difference. So if anything, I would say it's still pocketable with some caveats regarding its thickness. Okay, sticking with size, let's compare it against one other clamshell device. This is the Powkiddy V90, and I've made a couple videos about this device over the past few years. It's actually one of the best clamshell devices on the market. Honestly, there just haven't been that many clamshells coming out, and so this one, even at around $30 or $40, has been pretty great. You can see that it is quite a bit smaller than the Anbernic one, but the design is fairly similar. It has inline shoulder and trigger buttons and a removable battery in the back, and it has some surprisingly decent build quality for being so cheap and made by Powkiddy. Now the feel of this device is quite a bit different. For example, the face buttons and the D-pad use a rubber membrane connection. And then finally, this one is quite low powered. It can basically play most Super Nintendo, Game Boy Advance, and PS1 games, but not all of them. Anyway, here's a quick size comparison between the two, and you can see that yes, the Powkiddy is quite a bit smaller. However, even though when compared to other clamshells it does appear to be bigger, I think this is still a great size for a handheld in general. Let's take the Anbernic RG35XX Plus as an example. This one has the same size screen, but when closed up you can see that the SP is quite a bit smaller. So it does mean that the SP is a little bit more portable than the vertical one. However, when you open it up, it's quite a bit bigger and roomier. And that's kind of the beauty of clamshells, is that when you want it to be big, it is bigger than other devices. And when you want it to be small, it's smaller than those same devices as well. So as long as you're good with the ergonomics and thickness of a clamshell, it's kind of the best of both worlds. Here's another example. Look at how small it is compared to the Game Boy DMG. However, when we open it up, it's actually taller than the other one. It's kind of crazy. Here's another comparison against the Game Boy Color. As you can see, it's bigger when you need it to be and smaller when you need it to be as well. And finally, a couple more comparisons. Here's the RG35XXH as well as the RG28XX, and both of these have the exact same chipset inside. And of course, just because we can, here's a comparison against the Steam Deck OLED. In fact, I think the RG35XXSP is a great companion device to the Steam Deck if you want something smaller and more pocketable. Now, one of the side effects of having a clamshell device is that it has lots of plastic, which means it's going to be a little bit heavier. As you can see here, it is 197 grams. And that does make it heavier than other clamshells like the Game Boy Advance SP, as well as the Powkiddy V90. It's also a little bit heavier than the RG35XX Plus, as well as the RG35XXH. And all the same, I don't think it's a heavy device. For example, it's only about 7 grams heavier than the Game Boy Color, which I think is a pretty lightweight device. And so in the end, I do think that 197 grams is a little bit heavier than the others, but by no means heavy. Now, in addition to sending over the silver model, Anbernic also sent over the transparent blue one. And I'm glad they sent this one over because if I had to pick another one to choose, this would be the one. And so I'm pretty happy with these two choices. And I think this one looks pretty sharp. I like the fact that I can see inside and everything seems to be pretty symmetrical and nice looking. If we open it up, you can see that the PCB is white, giving the whole device a bit of a lighter look. I also like the fact that they are using these dark gray buttons. I think they look really sharp here. Another thing that's kind of neat, you can see that the magnets hold it into place when you snap it shut. However, one thing to note, just like with any transparent model, it does have a little bit of light bleed with those LEDs. Here's a comparison in a dark environment with the transparent model on the left and then a solid model on the right. And honestly, the light bleed here is not bad. Thankfully, these LEDs are pretty dim. The plastic texture between the two is also a little bit different. The one on the right has a little bit more of a gritty texture with the transparent model, but the solid models are a little bit more glossy and slick, much like with the original Game Boy Advance SP. And now that I've tested both of them myself, I think that between the two, I do prefer the solid colors of the silver one. And I think a lot of this just has to do with the fact that it reminds me a lot of an original Game Boy Advance SP. I think both colors are great, but yeah, I'm definitely team silver on this one. Okay, let's go ahead and boot the device up and take a look at the stock operating system. It takes about 24 seconds to boot up from start to finish, and the stock software experience looks to be almost identical to the other ones that we've seen with the other XX line devices. And so I'm just going to kind of breeze through this and verify that everything is working correctly. And the one thing that I did notice different from the previous model they released is that within the App Center, we now have the App section. On the other firmware versions, this was found within the RetroArch section. I think it makes sense that they have it in the App Center now. Now within here are a bunch of little apps that you can do to change the user experience, but one that I want to highlight is the quick shutdown option. And once we start this up, it gives us the option to either enable or disable the quick shutdown. It took me a minute to figure out what EN and DIS are supposed to mean, but yeah, it's enable and disable. Anyway, we're going to press Y to enable the quick shutdown. And then after that, it's going to allow you to choose what's going to happen when you actually close the clamshell. You can either have it just quickly shut down the device itself, or you can put it into sleep mode. For this example, we're going to choose sleep. So when we close the device, it's going to put it to sleep and not turn it off. So let me give you a demo of what that's like in game. If we close the shell, it is going to put it to sleep. You can hear the music for a moment and then it'll turn off. And when we open it up, it's going to go right back to where we were within the game. I'm not sure what the battery drain is going to be like within sleep. That's something I'll have to test for the final review. Now, if we just tap on the power button, it's going to do a quick shutdown. It'll say that it's exiting the game, and then the LED will turn off. At that point, the device is now turned off. So if we want, we can press and hold the power button for a moment, and that'll turn it back on. And the nice thing here is that it will have saved where you were in your game and then take you right back to where you were. And so I really like this function within the stock operating system, that we can close it to sleep and then we can also do a quick startup and go right back to where we were in the game. And of note, if you need to adjust the brightness, you can press the menu button and then up and down at any time. Speaking of which, let's do a test of the screen brightness. So let's go all the way to the dimmest point first and then the brightest. And as you can see, this screen will get pretty dim. Let's turn off the lights and yeah, I think this is pretty good. You could probably play this in the dark. Meanwhile, if you go to the max brightness, it's still pretty bright, definitely brighter than something like the RG28XX. And so I think we have a good dynamic range here between dimness and brightness. I'll test this further in my final review in actual daytime scenarios. But as it stands right now, I've got no complaints about this screen. It gets both dim and bright, and I think the colors look really good too. Okay, next let's do a quick audio test. This is going to be at full volume in an untreated room. And I think it sounds pretty good, given the fact that it has just a single mono speaker, and honestly, this is a cheaper device, so I don't have super high expectations. Okay, so that's it for a real quick hardware and software test. Let's now move into performance testing and just make sure that everything is going to be working as expected. Now, this chipset is well known at this point. I've tested like 4 or 5 devices with this chip, and so I just really want to make sure that it's performing as it is with the others. Now, with Game Boy and Game Boy Color, as expected, everything is playing just fine. It even actually gives you these automatic bezels when you're playing in RetroArch. I think it looks pretty good. I really like the bezels on the Game Boy Advance games because it actually shows the Game Boy Advance SP logo. I think that looks really sharp. Now, in terms of home console systems, I tested all these out, NES, Super Nintendo, and Genesis, and all these play really well. In fact, I really enjoyed playing these with a clicky D-pad because everything felt really precise. Like I mentioned before, it does take a bit of force to press down on these buttons, but honestly, after just a couple minutes of getting used to it, I didn't really notice it at all. But this is definitely something I'll need to test more because I want to see what it's like if I played it for like an hour or two straight and whether or not my fingers felt fatigued. Now, moving on to the higher end systems like Nintendo 64, these played about as well as expected. I did have to go in and remap the D-pad to function as the analog stick, but after that it worked out pretty well. Just bear in mind that like with any other device that lacks analog sticks, you might have some control limitations in the fact that you just don't have all the inputs that you could with an analog stick. And so while most Nintendo 64 games will play pretty well on this device, it's still going to be limited by the control scheme. So if anything, I would say treat Nintendo 64 like a bonus, in that not every game will play, but it's pretty cool when they do. And it'll be a similar story with Sega Dreamcast. The performance is about the same here, but you may be limited with games that allow for D-pad input, or you'll have to remap the analog stick as the D-pad. Either way, there are plenty of titles that are going to be playable on Dreamcast, and I think it's a lot of fun in a clamshell form factor. It's kind of crazy to play these games like this. And then finally, another system that is playable on this device with some limitations is going to be PSP. First and foremost, this is a 16:9 system, so it is going to look pretty small on a 3.5-inch screen that's 4:3 aspect ratio. And then also bear in mind that performance here is not quite as good as it is with Dreamcast and Nintendo 64, so you're mostly going to be stuck with lightweight games. But again, it is still pretty thrilling to be able to play a PSP game on a device that looks and feels like a Game Boy Advance SP. Now, one other thing I wanted to note is that I tried out Batocera as well as Knulli, which is the fork of Batocera, which is going to be coming out soon, and both of these worked out perfectly with the RG35XXSP. Now, these software builds are not even made for this device. They're made for the other RG35XX devices, but it's pretty awesome that it's booting from day one. Just bear in mind that it doesn't have full functionality. So for example, the sleep function doesn't work when you close the screen. Now, I'm not really surprised by that because it's obviously something that developers didn't anticipate with the other devices, but hopefully this is something that they can implement later. As it stands right now, when you close the device, the game will continue to run. So if you do want to put it to sleep, you'll have to tap on the power button first. I think that's a minor inconvenience to be able to put the device to sleep in the first place, but it is something you'll have to do. Now, Batocera and Knulli both also do not have a quick shutdown function like the stock operating system. Maybe that's something they can implement later, but as it stands right now, it doesn't have that feature. However, there are plenty of reasons why custom firmware on this device is going to be pretty awesome. For example, the Knulli operating system will support native Pico 8, which means you can play all these games using Explore and the Wi-Fi that's built in. And when Knulli goes to public release, it'll also have the ability to use Portmaster, which is going to be awesome. Not only that, I bet the other custom firmwares like MuOS will also be working on it. So I have a lot more testing to do before my final review. Either way, I think that's enough testing for some first impressions, so we can already start wrapping up and talk about some of the things that I'm liking and not liking so far. Because this is not a final review, let's go ahead and just wrap up by talking about some of the things that are so good about it and some of the things that are not so good as well. We'll start with the so good stuff, and number one is the fact that this is a clamshell. There's a lot of reasons why people love a clamshell form factor. Not only is it pretty comfortable to use, but it also works as its own screen protector, and the device can get pretty small when closed and pretty big when opened. And I'm very surprised that Anbernic kind of nailed it when it came to the whole clamshell thing. This is their first time using this form factor, and I really can't find any faults in it. The fact that they got so close to the original Game Boy Advance SP is pretty darn impressive. In fact, that's my number 2 point about the things that I like about this device is that it does feel very familiar. If you've ever used a Game Boy Advance SP before and you have a special place in your heart for it, you're going to be right at home here. Now, another thing that surprised me is that with most Anbernic devices, when they release it, there's some sort of boneheaded decision along the way. For example, sometimes they'll just remove a feature or maybe add a big screen bezel or just something that looks really weird. And I think this might be one of the first Anbernic devices I've ever tested where it's mostly positive. It's pretty crazy. And among those added features, some of my favorite are the fact that it has Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and HDMI. All those things are great in a really small handheld, so I'm glad they kept them in. I also think that the stock operating system on this device keeps getting better and better. In particular, I love this quick shutdown feature that we can just close the game in the middle of it and then start it right back up. And I also love the fact that when closing the device, we can either put it to sleep or choose to power it off. And then finally, the last thing I found to be so good about this device is that it is surprisingly comfortable. Not only does it have the same look and feel of the Game Boy Advance SP, which I always found to be a pretty comfortable device, but it's a little bit bigger, which makes it more comfortable for adult-sized hands. And so I think even people who maybe thought that the Game Boy Advance SP was just a little bit too small and crampy will actually like the experience on this one more. Now, of course, no device is perfect, and I found a couple nitpicks, so let's go over the things that I found to be not so good. The first is that the buttons on this device are quite loud and clicky. This includes the shoulder and trigger buttons as well as just the D-pad and face buttons themselves. I think that if you tried to play this in bed on a quiet night next to your partner, it might wake them up. It is pretty loud. In addition, I think that many people will find this device is larger than expected. It still has all the benefits of a clamshell in that it's smaller than a regular device when closed and bigger when opened, but all the same, I was surprised to see just how big and chunky this guy was. And then finally, it is worth noting that these buttons are quite firm to the touch. As to whether or not this is going to be fatiguing for most people, I think the jury's still out and that requires a lot more testers than just me. But if you're the type of person who likes a light button, then I do think these are going to feel pretty firm for you. Either way, when it comes down to it, even in my first few hours with this device, I can already tell that this is going to be one of my favorites of the year. I've definitely got some more testing to do, but as it stands right now, I'm really happy with this device. Now, one big question mark with this device is that we don't know the price yet, and I think we'll know it very soon, but at least as of making this video, I'm not sure. And I'll definitely push that out once I know more about it, but I'm hoping that it'll be around $75 or less. Especially when you consider the fact that the other devices with this chipset are usually around $60 or cheaper. I do expect that this device was probably quite a bit more expensive to manufacture compared to the others, given the fact that we have that clamshell, but I am hoping that this will stay within the budget category. And I think the best way to really show how much of a value this is going to be is to compare it against a Game Boy Advance SP in 2024. So about a month ago, I ended up buying my own aftermarket Game Boy Advance SP because I knew that a bunch of clamshells were going to be coming out this year, so I needed it to compare with. Now, I probably could have gone and modded one myself and done all that stuff, but I like the idea of letting somebody else do it for me. So I looked at a bunch of different listings and I settled on this one here from eBay. This allowed me to pick whatever color I would want for the shell, and then also I got a version 2 IPS panel. It was definitely on the more expensive side. It was about $190 to get this version. But I like the fact that it came brand new with a new screen and also this nice metallic shell. So let's say on average, people are paying somewhere between $100 and $200 for a Game Boy Advance SP, and I think they're well worth it. They are pretty awesome to actually use. After all, you throw in a flash cart and you can now play every Game Boy Advance game directly on the device. So now let's compare it against the value of the RG35XXSP. After all, this thing can basically be a Game Boy Advance as well, but with a larger screen, a higher resolution, and the ability to use all these software emulation perks like cheats and fast forward. So if you think about it, this thing is kind of an ultimate Game Boy Advance SP. But of course it doesn't end there. It also can be a clamshell Game Boy and a Game Boy Color. And it can also function as a clamshell NES and a Genesis and even a Super Nintendo. And you probably know where I'm going with this, but it can also work as a Pico 8 machine, even running it natively. And you can also play any number of old arcade classics on here as well. Not only that, it can push performance to the higher end systems like PlayStation 1, Nintendo 64, Sega Dreamcast, and even PSP. So when it comes down to it, if you are a fan of clamshell devices and you're okay with it being a little bit larger and having buttons that are a little bit harder to press down on, then I think you should be very excited for the RG35XXSP. It's been a long time since somebody released a Linux-based clamshell that is also at a budget price. So as long as Anbernic keeps this at a more budget price of something like $75 or cheaper, I think this is going to be an excellent solution for many people. And I'm really looking forward to the next week or so of testing before I make that final review, because I'm pretty excited about this one. In fact, it might become my go-to device in terms of portability. I love the fact that the screen itself is protected when I close it up, but then also it is pretty roomy and comfortable when I open it up to actually play. So in the end, I think that Anbernic nailed it in two different ways. The first is that they made a clamshell device with no big deal breakers. And then secondly, they also captured the look and feel of the original Game Boy Advance SP, one of the most beloved handhelds of all time. So let me know what you think of these first impressions, and also, are there any things you'd like me to test in the final review? Let me know in the comments down below. As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.